Woe to a godless ideology. Hello, good day to everyone. Today, we'll discuss a topic that most Filipinos and even foreigners who have settled in the Philippines know very little about. The information is basically obscured by subjective media propaganda that revolves around the events that are covered by them in their news concerning the topic, about the people and the events, as well as the ideology that the people who used to espouse during those days. The events that are covered in this video reflect on the years in between 1983 up to the present, and the title is Woe to a Godless Ideology. But before we begin with the topic, let us first declare praise and glory belongs to the Almighty God in heaven. Amen. Now let's tackle. Former Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., against the wishes of former President Ferdinand Marcos, decided to return to the Philippines from the US to rekindle his political rivalry with the former president. He had been criticizing the administration of the former president without let up after he had his bypass heart surgery done in the US. For the part of the former president, there was no one more stubborn than the former senator. In fact, he was the only thorn in the former president's neck. And as secret as the former senator concealed the date of his arrival, even using a pseudonym for it did not at all escape the meticulous eyes of former President Marcos' intelligence machinery. Soon after, it was already known to him and the international media that went along or who went along with the plane riding with the former senator. And on August 21, 1983, the senator arrived. Whether the assassination of that former senator right at the airport was masterminded by the former president himself or by the First Lady, Mrs. Imelda Marcos, according to some sources, or by the by the military chief of staff, General Fabian Ver, or the ill-fated suspect named Rolando Galman, nothing came out really of the government's investigation. And of course, the case that was filed against the chief of staff, General Fabian Ver, was actually acquitted by the court. And so the final culprit was laid on the ill-fated suspect named Rolando Galman. So suddenly, all the efforts of the former president to put up a stable and strong political image, which he bragged to the Americans when he came to the US and met former President Ronald Reagan in 1982, went down in shambles. The assassination of the late senator itself caused a massive bank run on the Philippine National Bank, the country's biggest bank at that time. The former president himself, Ferdinand Marcos, guaranteed Mr. Lucio Tan, one of his cronies, for the bailout fund that was secured from the IMF World Bank. And within days, resulting from the assassination and the perceived political instability, foreign funds started capital flight out of the country. the elites in Philippine society organized themselves into what was called as the August 21 movement, and emboldened by that assassination, tried to stage an open defiance against the administration of former President Marcos. When they marched the dead body of Senator Nino Aquino for his final rest, Manila stood still. Tens of thousands of people came out of their houses and into Manila's main roads following the body of the late senator towards his last resting place. The mass of people on the street was so eerie, and it was almost a revolution. But former President Marcos held on to power. What suffered instead was the Philippine economy. The IMF World Bank bailout was not enough. The capital flight was not enough. Businesses one by one started closing down. The Philippine GDP started to plummet. And worse, the communists, who were already in the Philippines as early as 1930, exploited the situation and pushed for more industrial strikes here and there, for the purpose of recruiting to their legal front more people and expanding their base as far as they could. There were three main political forces that were formed as a result of that tragic assassination. One was the Philippine elites, who called themselves as the Social Democrats. Generally, these people were in alliance with the second political force, which was the Catholic Church or the clergy, while the third force was the one clandestinely being run by the communist CPP, NPA, and DF, who were called the National Democrats. These three political forces worked together to weaken the government of former President Marcos. The most controversial, however, among these forces were the National Democrats, or in local parlance, the Communists. The Communist movement in the Philippines started in 1930, when the Filipino labor leader Crisanto Evangelista organized the Soviet-aligned Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas. When the Japanese forces occupied the Philippines in 1942 and brought World War II until 1945, the Communists sought the support of the peasant movement of Luis Taruc, and with them, they formed the guerrilla forces called the Hukbalahap, or the Hukbong Bayan Laban sa Hapones, to fight the Japanese. When the Japanese were defeated, the Hukbalahap tried to enter national politics and to run for Congress. They did win some seats, but through the insistence of the Americans, President Manuel Rojas denied them the chance to occupy the congressional seats they won, and accused them of winning those seats by force of arms, or by making the people cower under them. So, because of that, because of the denial for them to take their seats in Congress, they finally decided to continue their struggle, and instead of laying down their arms and reconciling with the government, decided to hold on to those firearms and to continue their struggle against both the Philippine government and its U.S. master. It was in 1950 when the Lava brothers, Jose Lava and Jesus Lava, managed to wrestle control and leadership of the movement from Luis Taruk, and from there, changed the name of the Hukbalahap into the Hukbong Mapagpalaya ng Bayan, and led it with a Leninist Marxist political line. It was at this point also when Luis Taruk and Jesus Lava started to argue concerning the direction of the movement it should take. Their difference in political line and in beliefs and in their ideologies became the focal point of their conflict. Soon enough, Jesus Lava was ruling the movement, was actually a hardcore communist who came from Crisanto Evangelista's Communist Party. This Communist Party upheld the Marxist-Leninist line, where the so-called proletariat or the working class was supposed to be the vanguard or the leader of the party and the revolution. But Luis Taruk, however, was a peasant leader, and his movement was a peasant movement. Its primary members were Filipino peasants. And at that time, the communist lesson drawn from Mao Zedong, where the revolution was spearheaded by the peasant, was not yet acknowledged and integrated in the communist thought. The differences on the political line of both leaders, Luis Taruk and Jesus Lava, eventually led to the parting off between the two. The group of Jesus Lava renounced the peasant group of Luis Taruk, while Luis Taruk took with him the remnants of the old Hooks and established their final base at the foot of Mount Arayat, and from there continued their armed struggle. In 1954, however, Luis Taruk and the Hook guerrillas surrendered to President Ramon Magsaysay, trusting in him and finally giving an end to the struggles of the Hooks. While in 1964, Jesus Lava was arrested by the Philippine Constabulary and charged politically for his illegal political activities, related, of course, to the communist movement. In 1962, the young radical Jose Maria Sison, a student and a young radical at that time, became a member of the Jesus Lava-led Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas, or PKP. And in 1964, he was one of the organizers of the Kabataang Makabayan, which was organized to serve as the recruitment base of the communist Filipinos at that time. When Jesus Lava was arrested in 1964, the Soviet-leaning Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas somehow lost an able leader who could have guided them in the direction that they should take. The years that followed became a soul-searching period for the Filipino communists. But in 1968, a major breakthrough occurred. Armed with the lessons learned from the old party, the PKP, Jose Maria Sison, with a handful of associates, launched what they termed as the first rectification campaign or movement within the Communist Party or the Communist movement itself. Distancing themselves from the hardline Marxist-Leninist political line and accommodating the peasant struggle learned from the Hooks, as well as acknowledging the lessons learned from Chairman Mao Zedong of China, the group of Jose Maria Sison renounced the old Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas held by the Lavas or by the Lava brothers for so long and organized themselves as the new Communist Party of the Philippines in December 1968. In March 1969, the leadership of the newly established Communist Party of the Philippines met with the remnants of the old Hukbong Mapagpalaya ng Bayan or HMB and established under them the armed wing of the new Communist Party and named it the New People's Army. Thus, the CPP-NPA tandem was born. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, a wave of student protest, radicalization, and agitation was launched in 1970 involving major schools within Manila. This campaign was called the First Quarter Storm, and it was a test case meant to find out whether the newly established Communist Party of the Philippines can already engage the Filipino people with large civil unrest or protest action enough to cause alarm to the state. This campaign called the First Quarter Storm was successful. It was successful that it agitated and radicalized a substantial number of students in Manila, making the protest movement in the Philippines an undeniable problem of the state or the government. And to cement the statement or the signal that the communist was trying to convey to the government of former President Ferdinand Marcos, in 1971, the Communist Party spearheaded the launching of the Diliman Commune. They barricaded and suspended the operation of the University of the Philippines for 1 week in February 1971 in protest of the 3 centavo increase in the price of oil. For a simple issue of the oil price increase in February 1971, the Communists of the Philippines staged a major activity, the launching of the Diliman Commune, where they closed the operation of the University of the Philippines and barricaded it for an entire week. It was a shock to the government of former President Ferdinand Marcos that they could really do that already. Now, the campaign was successful, that it really did brought a chilling effect on the administration of former President Marcos. However, and unknown to the former president, the biggest setback in his administration was actually the radicalization of some members of the Philippine Military Academy, specifically the young Lieutenant Victor Corpus at that time. His radicalization eventually led to his defection to the CPP-NPA, and then in December 1970, he led a raid to the armory of the Philippine Military Academy, taking away a considerable number of high-powered firearms, delivering it to the New People's Army. That was a major event in the administration of former President Ferdinand Marcos. It was later in a testimony of the Brigadier General. He already was a Brigadier General at that time, because during the People Power of 1986, the young lieutenant then in 1970 surrendered and returned to the fold of the law. And because of the grace of the former President Cory Aquino, Victor Corpus was reinstated to the Philippine Military Academy. And from there, he returned to the service and earned his rank to become a brigadier general. It was according to him that the Communist Party of the Philippines actually planned the Plaza Miranda bombing in August 1971. That bombing killed 9 people and injured more than 100. The Plaza Miranda bombing that occurred in August 1971 was timed during the proclamation rally of the Liberal Party for the local and mayoralty and senatorial election to be held in November of that year. In the middle of the program and in front of the multitude of people attending it, 2 hand grenades were tossed on the stage by some unidentified assailants. The death of 9 people and the injury of 100 more was one of the bases that former President Marcos cited in his declaration of martial law in 1972, including the first quarter storm and the defection to the communist side and raid on the Philippine Military Academy armory of General Victor Corpus. On the part of the communist movement, it was the personal testimony of General Victor Corpus, corroborated by the late journalist Max Sullivan, using his reliable sources, that it was actually not only the communist movement itself, but rather the personal effort of its chairman, Jose Maria Sison, to plan and pick the correct men who executed the plan. According to General Victor Corpus, he personally overheard Sison and the men Sison tasked to do the job after that mission was accomplished. According to the retired general, Jose Maria Sison believed that Marcos at that time could be forced to act to an event and initiate repressive policies that could, in effect, lead to further hasten the recruitment process of the communists and push the Philippine society to the brink of revolution, which was the one they were hoping for. Although Jose Maria Sison up to present has denied involvement on the said bombing, the late journalist Max Sullivan corroborated that story from his own reliable sources. Now, if that was true, then Jose Maria Sison at that time was in fact correct in his analysis, because less than a year later, former President Ferdinand Marcos would actually declare martial law and would initiate massive crackdown on those opposing his administration, be they the legal political opposition led by the Liberal Party or the illegal revolutionaries led by the CPP-NPA. The communists were correct. The martial law declared by former President Marcos and the political crackdown he initiated under it resulted in the phenomenal growth of the New People's Army. The Manila-based students who were radicalized during the first quarter storm and during the Diliman Commune and in other political campaigns initiated by the Communist Party went underground and joined the New People's Army in the rural areas to escape political repression. With that, their ranks doubled and tripled through the years. And to finally catch the ever growing number of Filipinos joining the political dissent against the administration of former President Marcos, in a broad political alliance, Jose Maria Sison organized the National Democratic Front in 1973. It was a brilliant political strategy because not all who espouse progressive political causes and not all who are engaging in political dissent openly adhere to the ideology of communism or openly adhere to the cause of revolution. Secondly, there were valid political and social issues that could be addressed or responded to through legal political actions without resorting to armed struggle. That was the purpose of the National Democratic Front, to catch and capture these progressive political forces in a broad political alliance that would espouse the affirmation of their valid sectoral political issues. Thus, a political force not necessarily communist, but were hiding in a so-called legal front called National Democrats was created. The first great rectification movement initiated by Jose Maria Sison through the establishment of the new Communist Party of the Philippines under his leadership finally was completed. The hardline stance of the old party on proletarian-led revolution exemplified by the Russian Bolsheviks was finally dropped in favor of the coalition of the proletariat and the peasants, taking cue from Mao Zedong's peasant-based protracted People's War. And that was why the CPP-NPA tandem worked on the idea that while the proletariat took the ideological lead through the Communist Party, the peasants, through the New People's Army, supplied the movement with its own army. And to make the revolution broad, encompassing as far as democracy would permit, and as mass-based as it could, the National Democratic Front took the lead. And the three-pronged CPP, NPA, NDF held the Philippine society in sway during the years of the martial law and beyond. The CPP, NPA, NDF has identified the enemy. The enemy was the U.S. Marcos dictatorship and U.S. imperialism. It was this line that the NDF tried to force upon the people. They fed the Filipino people with this propaganda, exposing the alliance, the suppressive and exploitative alliance between the U.S. and the government of former President Ferdinand Marcos. And this was the one they fed upon the Filipino people when the late Senator Ninoy Aquino Jr. was assassinated in 1983. But then the Filipino elites didn't buy that line. In the first place, they had their own political and economic interest, and they were beneficiaries also of the U.S.-Philippine relations, and they were moderates who believed not in social revolution but rather in political reform, especially the replacement of the former President Marcos and the restoration of liberal democracy in the Philippines. These people, these moderates, were called the Social Democrats. It was, however, the stubbornness of uh, former President Ferdinand Marcos who dragged him to the end of his political career. However, neither did he cave in for the call for political reforms, nor did he stop the counterinsurgency efforts and repression committed by the military on both the real communists as well as the suspected ones that weakened his grip on power. However, the most damaging aspect was the economic crisis caused by the assassination of former Senator Benigno Aquino. Massive bank runs, capital flight, closures of businesses, industrial strikes, and general political instability and dissent, as well as the agitation of the studentry, further pursued by the communist-led National Democrats, have pushed the Philippine society in the brink of revolution. By the day, the cloud of the moderate Social Democrats over the Filipino people was waning, while the influence of the communist-led National Democrats was increasing. The communists were wise not to isolate these moderates in Philippine society. They think that these elites, despite their preference and ability to become anti-people, somehow could be used in the political struggle. That was why they took every opportunity to be allied with these moderates in every campaign and whenever it is possible. And whenever there were disagreements between them, between the hardline National Democrats and the moderate Social Democrats, the National Democrats would accommodate and they would always try to compromise and find a basis of unity just in order to involve them in a broad alliance. The communists had this strategy of slowly isolating them, however, and separating them and alienating them from U.S. influence. And finally, the U.S. was fed up with the situation. They felt that each day the former president Ferdinand Marcos was losing his clout over the Philippine society and that revolution was already knocking at the door. At the final minute, whether Ferdinand Marcos would agree or not, they forced him to hold an unscheduled snap election just to renew his mandate over the Filipino people. From the onset, the initial standard bearer of the moderate Social Democrats for that election was Mr. Sorry, excuse me. The standard bearer of the moderate Social Democrats was Mr. Salvador Laurel. He was the leader of the Liberals. But they decided to field in, instead of him, the neophyte widow of the assassinated Senator Benigno Aquino. the late President Cory Aquino. She was chosen to fight Marcos in the election because she symbolized political purity and political persecution. These were powerful symbols that the moderates thought would increase their winnability and would make Cory Aquino loved by the people and would make her succeed in face of the juggernaut political machinery of the former president. On the other hand, the communist-led National Democrats thought of the snap election as an opportunity to expose further the despondency of the U.S. Marcos regime and to use it to recruit more and to expand further their influence. And so, while the moderate Social Democrats joined the election, the communist-led National Democrats boycotted it, and the parting up between them was decided. What the communists failed to foresee, however, and was the biggest blunder they ever committed in the history of Filipino struggle, was the EDSA people power and the overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos in a spontaneous mass action which led them in isolation, failing to take the initiative which should have already theirs to begin with. The Communist Party of the Philippines relied on empiricism, lessons of the lessons of their own practical experience here, as well as around the world, that says despots will always cling on to power and will do even the most bizarre way of cheating just to hold on to that power. And that the duty of the revolutionary movement was to expose it and oppose the political repression and build up the political dissent until a so-called critical mass would be achieved enough to tip the balance and push the revolution. They were hoping that the moderates would eventually realize this when they fail in the election. This so much so that the built-up frustration would push them to the side of the revolution. And what they wanted to do was exactly to push for this situation. Although prior to the snap election, the New People's Army was already estimated to be within the 25,000 to 30,000 strong army established all over the Philippines, yet a direct military confrontation with the armed forces of the Philippines would still somehow render them vulnerable and would somehow result to their annihilation, especially that the U.S. was still maintained, or the U.S. still maintained the two largest military bases in the Philippines outside its own territory. And then that the armed forces of the Philippines outnumbered the New People's Army on a ratio of 6-1. The communists knew that the best option was to build a broad alliance with all the Filipino people as possible and establish a broad mass base. In this regard and in this analysis, some militaristic-minded cadres within the communist movement estimated that the movement was already on the stalemate stage of the revolution. Although the number of the New People's Army was still not enough, but with the broad number of Filipino people supporting the cause of the National Democrats, they thought that it was enough to push the situation. And their idea was actually to push for a stage called urban insurrection and to push for the strategic counteroffensive, since they thought that with the number of Filipino people supporting the cause of the national democratic movement under them, a so-called political stalemate has been achieved in spite their number, their uh, armed New People's Army was not enough to match the number of the Philippine military. However, because they were wrong with that analysis, they did not foresee the field military coup of former Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile and former President Fidel Ramos, which led to the people power. They were actually overrun by events, and they were left isolated by the spontaneous people power revolution that toppled former President Marcos. The US actually was the winner in this. The US succeeded and simply switched puppets from Marcos. They switched relations to Cory Aquino, and the huge mass base that the communists used to enjoy, the communists have built since the martial days, had finally fizzled out in thin air. The political reformists won the struggle and the revolutionary atmosphere. The armed revolution died down. The Communist Party of the Philippines was left gaping at the great blunder they committed and the loss of political initiative they experienced. Massive demoralization among the movement's rank and file followed within the succeeding years, and their forces, both the New People's Army and the Legal Front under the National Democratic Front, declined and lost a lot of people. These people, those who lay low and finally separated themselves from the movement, decided to simply lay low and find a new life after the new political dispensation emerged. The Communist Party of the Philippines, in trying to understand what happened and try to learn some lessons from it, came out with a document called Rectify Our Errors and Reaffirm Our Basic Principles. It was prepared and penned no less by the chairman, Jose Maria Sison, who used the pseudonym Armando Liwanag. He placed the blame on the insurrectionist members and cadres of the party, especially on some prominent members of the Metro Manila Rizal Regional Party Committee. The document was not taken lightly by those members offended by it. The Metro Manila Rizal Regional Party Committee took a stand and rejected the document and declared independence from the party central committee. Thus, they were called Rejectionists. Other high-level party committees confronted the question, and thus the so-called RJ or Rejectionist versus the RA or reaffirmist emerged within the movement. It was not just a difference in principles and appreciation of the blunder that took place after the People Power Revolution. It was actually a direct, actual armed confrontation Soon, those who remained with Jose Maria Sison and the Central Committee of the Communist Party, who later renounced those who rejected the party leadership under Sison, took on the task of assassinating and purging its own members. The Communist Party and the movement started killing its own children, and hundreds died under the purgings, or judged to die by their own court, and were labeled enemies of the people. The steady decline was unstoppable. The once promising movement that offered the Filipino people salvation from their age-old poverty and social injustice met its gruesome end. But of course, the chairman, Jose Maria Sison, would not admit to any crime and would not declare surrender in spite the truth facing him. He even bragged of completing a so-called second rectification movement done in between 1992 to 1998, promising to continue the supposed struggle of the Filipino people with renewed vigor and rearmed conviction, no matter how long it takes. The basic principle that he was harping about and instructing the remnants of the CPP-NP-NDF was no other than the so-called People's Protracted War. Because of the condition of the Philippines that did not change, according to him, through the years, a prolonged and long-drawn revolution was needed. In spite, the Filipino people has repeated it over and over, has rejected it over and over again. And in spite, the ideology that they espouse was already rejected around the world. Communism has fallen. And to harp it as the solution to the age-old poverty of the Filipino people and the social injustice the Filipino people has experienced through the years is but futile. And the problem is because the Filipino people are God-believing people. And the problem is this ideology believes in no God and espouses violence, no less than Filipinos killing Filipinos. And the truth is, up to now, the only thing they are trying to achieve was to gain political power and snatch it from whatever administration was put in place by the Filipino people over the Philippines. That is the basic truth. And so, communism is futile. It's a godless ideology that will not be espoused by the Filipino people. To God be the glory. Amen.